Hello, and welcome to the initial offering of the instructional series on how to play defense on the volleyball court presented by Next Generation Volleyball. And I want to warn you right up front that this is not going to be your standard approach to the volleyball, playing defense on the volleyball court. We're gonna take a very different look at this dynamic. And if you're tuning into this to learn how to keep a good platform and how to face the net and such like that, this is not going to be that in any way. We're going to offer you a great number of very different ways to look at the game of volleyball on the defensive end. This particular video today is going to focus on the indoor game. We've got another one coming on the outdoor game. And in this one, we're also only going to focus on tactics, meaning primarily spacing and also what's going on in the minds of the defensive players, what their priorities are, and what they're going to be focusing on. All right, so let's get right to it. And again, thank you for tuning in. All right, so here we go. All right, so first thing we want to talk a little bit about is the game of volleyball. We found that at least this is. I've taken some statistics at the women's level in the Division I, and I haven't maybe taken enough to be really certain, exactly precise about these numbers. And also, I invite the listeners to take stats on their own level and see how it corresponds. I'm pretty confident that these numbers are going to be fairly accurate at both the college and national team level. I've taken a little stats on the men's side too. They're pretty similar, a little bit different, but pretty similar. This needs more work. I'll tell you that right now to really hone in on it. But I think we've got a pretty decent idea of what's going on. The primary point I'm trying to make with these numbers and with what's going on here is to focus on the easy ones first. I think we spend way too much effort and time trying to play defense against the hard-driven spike. And that's not the way to play this game. It is very difficult to dig a hard-driven spike, especially on the men's side. And we spend way too much effort, and we're missing tremendous opportunity to dig a lot more balls if we start to ignore or at least lower prioritize the driven ball and start to focus rather instead on this, what I call slop. And the slop is any shot or deflection, anything that's not a driven ball that's still in play. We're going to call slop. All right, so let's take a look at some of these numbers. All right. Like I said, there's typically 100 attempts. And we'll call it, these are defensive attempts, and a defensive attempt or defensive opportunity will define very simply as any play that passes or penetrates the net and is in play. So, for instance, a ball that deflects off the block and winds up in the stands, not a defensive opportunity. A blocked ball that rattles around the block and falls at the blocker's feet, not a defensive opportunity. Anything that lands in the court is a defensive opportunity, whether or not it's reasonable to dig. We're going to still call that a defensive opportunity. And anything that lands anywhere within range, whether it's in or out of the court, off of a deflection, we're going to call another a defensive opportunity. So we're seeing about 100 per match. Maybe it's a little bit less. We're rounding up to 100. Certainly 100 does occur, especially a better chance of obviously a 5-game match. So roughly 100 attempts. Of those attempts on the women's side, we're seeing 50 are in system, 50 are out of system. At the men's level, it's actually more like 60 to 70 are out of system at the men's level, but we'll set that aside for the moment. Of the 50 in system attempts that your defense will see, 35 of those are driven, and 15 again we'll call slop. Again, let's redefine slop as a deflection or a shot, anything that's not a hard-driven ball that's still in play. Of those 50 in-system plays, 8 wind up driven, and we dig them. But here's the key point one of the key points I'm making here. Let's look at this. That means there's 0 swings. So we get 8 driven balls that we dig in a match, no swings. So these are free balls, down balls, no real good swings. Of the 100 attempts, 8 of these 50 in-system attempts, rather, 8 are slop, and we dig all, and 8 turn into all swings. In fact, about half of those are in-system swings. 4 plus 4. 4 in-system, 4 out-of-system. So right off the top, we can see what's the point of trying to dig these driven balls when there's not that many to begin with? Now, certainly it's better to keep the ball in play than not. You get another chance to maybe make a point. But my goodness, let's really start thinking about trying to dig the slot balls, even for an in-system play. So what happens on these in-system plays is your defense steals in like, oh my gosh, they're all focused on digging that driven ball. And this is really where the money is to be made, off the slot. Give your blockers a chance to make a deflection. Keep your defenders loose. The ball deflects off the block. And you got a shot to not only run it down, but to then run it back at it. All right, so let's look at the out-of-system plays. Now, obviously, there's going to be a lot less driven balls. But again, we're seeing the same dynamic. 38 of these are slop, meaning, again, deflections or shots, but we're only digging 20 of them. And yet, of those 20, we're getting 20 swings. And it's a lot of these, about 10 are going to be an in-system swing. This is where the money is. We want to dig the slop. We want to dig the deflections. Not worry about the driven balls, because look, we are digging a few, but we're getting 0 swings. So what I'm trying to focus on here is, sure, it's okay and good to dig the driven ball. Keep it in play. But let's focus on where the money is to be made. And that's digging, the slop, and the shots. All right. So I guess my point there hopefully is made. We're not going to be worrying too much. We're going to prioritize the driven ball. We're going to ask our defenders to stay loose, to stay comfy, to stay relaxed, and be ready for deflections and shots, because that's where we're going to be making the money. That's where we're going to be able to make a defensive play and keep the ball in play. All right, so let's talk a little bit about spacing. All right. So we have an attacker here. Let's assume we have a right-handed attacker, offhand, 2 blockers. Perhaps in another video we'll talk about 3 blockers. It's not a bad idea to put 3 blockers up, but the reality of the game is that it's just rarely do we get that opportunity. So we're going to talk about 2 blockers, and where do we space everybody else? All right. So here's what we typically do, right? We start in here. We start our players in here in case there's a middle attack, and then we back our players up 2 or 3 steps and put them in here. But the problem with this, and I guess I didn't get into this when we talked about stats, is you're not going to dig the quick attack. You're just not. On the women's side, about 1 per match driven balls on a quick attack are dug. Maybe 1 per match per team. Maybe. On the men's side, 1 every 3 games, you're going to see one of the men dig a driven ball on the quick attack. And yet, time after time, we're asking our players to start in close and back up right when the play is unfolding and when we need them, our defenders, to be highly focused and ready, calm and ready to play defense. And we're asking them to back up in the middle of the play for no reason. This is just nonsense. So the first thing I want to focus here is ignore the middle attack. Ignore the middle attack. Please, coaches, if you're hearing this, I want you to study some of your stats and just take a look at how many middle attacks on a driven ball you're digging. And even aside whether or not we should be backing up like I just mentioned, the scatter charts that I run on middle attacks make no sense to have our players here, even if we are digging middle of balls, because the middle attacks are not landing here under any circumstance, whether they're driven or blocked. They're just not landing that close. So there's no reason to have our players be backing up. Let's start them deep and keep them deep. Take the stress off of them. All right. So now that we've got that, please ignore the middle attack. It's just not sensible. All right. So now what? So as I've mentioned, what we're going to try to focus on is digging. Our primary focus is digging the easy ones first. So where are we playing? Where are we going to space these players? So the next thing that I've learned is the line digger almost never digs a hard-driven ball on the line. Maybe once per match or less. It's less often than a middle attack being dug. So we're gonna keep this guy or lady very loose and not have her or him focus at all on digging a driven ball. It's just not reasonable. So what we have found is a great number of plays are rattling around here and winding up out of bounds, out this way. So these balls rattle around and out they come, winding up out here, out here, out here. And in fact, we can, some of those balls that wind up in the stands, we think our line digger can actually defend, bring those back into the game. So we're going to ask our line digger to actually stay out of bounds right here. Now, if this digger happens to be your setter, then we need to be mindful that he or she can still get in to set the ball. So keep that in mind when you space this player, when you line him or her up. But we're asking this player to stay out of bounds, especially on an out-of-system play. Oh my gosh. Out-of-system plays wind up rattling around and coming out of bounds here or off the side all the time. We figure that this player is digging maybe one ball per set and ought to be digging two or three. So that's the first change we're going to make. Let's talk. Now you might think, oh my gosh, what about the dink? Well, what about the dink? Let's talk about that right now. If this player is playing this deep, well, we're giving up a lot of space here for the dink. So what we're going to ask this outside blocker, typically this blocker is going to line up here, back up, and try to make a play back here. Well, as you can guess, that's not how we're going to suggest you play this game. This outside blocker, this offside blocker, we're going to ask to simply rotate around, stay right there. We want this player to be an arm's length of the net so that because we're seeing about one play per set, 5 per match, rattles around the block and slides down the net, landing somewhere in here. And this player needs to be able to make that play. Up to now, that play is almost never made, but it's certainly a doable dig. So we're going to ask this player to stay within arm's length of the net, focused and be ready to dig this dink. Because this player is going to be too deep. So this player can probably cover up to, say, roughly around in here. This player's got this dink and anything that rattles around and comes down the net. This player is not at all ever going to think about digging a driven ball because it never happens anyway. I defy any of you, I shouldn't say that, it's probably happened somewhere, but you're going to have a lot of trouble finding some footage of the offhand blocker, offside blocker, making a dig on a driven ball. It just doesn't happen. So there is 3 myths, so to speak, that were already thrown out. Number 1, you can't dig the middle attack on a driven ball. Number 2, line digger is not digging a driven ball. And number 3, offhand blocker is not digging a driven ball. So we're going to make adjustments to recognize that reality. And that's why we're asking these players to to radically change their spacing on the court. We're going to recognize they're not digging driven balls, and they're going to be digging only deflections, dinks, what we call slop. Okay, so let's talk about the middle back player. So we're eliminating his or her opportunity to dig middle attacks because we've already identified that's not going to happen. What we want this player to do is play almost out of bounds, maybe even out of bounds, because we want this player to have great range side to side. We're seeing a lot of balls here. Alternatively, on the women's side, interestingly, we're seeing a lot of driven balls landing in this area. So this is an area that needs more, I believe, research. But you might make a case that on the in-system attack, we're going to have this player right here on an in-system attack. Because these cross-court balls tend to wind up right in that area. Maybe not. Again, we're going to need more work on this. But I'm inviting all of you to run your own scatter charts. But when you run your scatter charts, I want you to have 2 different colored pencils or something like that. So you're identifying slop versus driven balls. Because the slop balls, we ought to be making a lot more plays. And I'm very hesitant to suggest that this player play here to dig driven balls when I've already told you that it's not easy to dig driven balls. And even when you do, you're not running an offense against it, with it. You're just probably going to give them a down ball or a free ball. Nonetheless, I want to also recognize that this area does receive a lot of driven balls. And on the ladies' side, at least, the ladies have a little bit better chance of digging driven balls. So we're gonna throw that out. Okay. For the time being, though, I'm going to ask you continue to leave the middle back player right on the back line. And the angle digger, we're not going to move too much. We're going to keep him or her right about there. This person has responsibility through this area, right in here. This is his or her responsibility. You might say, oh, well, what about right in the middle of the court? What about this area? Well, we feel that by giving both of these defenders a little bit better, and you'll see how we're going to share that with you, a little bit better ideas about how to move more efficiently on the court, we think these 2 players can cover that. Obviously, it's very situational depending on what's going on during the play. All right. So this player, again, might be digging a few driven balls, but even this player is not going to be focused on digging driven balls. So what we want to do is prioritize in the players' minds what's going on the volleyball court. Let's take a look. So the first thing we want to focus on is dinks. And this is going to be the primary responsibility of the offhand blocker. But if you have players that on the women's side are 6'2", let's say, and can really tattoo the ball and can hit the thing at 70, 80 miles an hour, and we're seeing them put up some dinks once in a while, oh my gosh, we're begging the offense to dink the ball. It is a lot easier to pick up a dink than it is a 70-mile-an-hour driven attack. And when they do dink, we need to dig every one of those. We should be able to go an entire season without one of these dropping. And if they do drop, as a coach, you really need to rethink all of your practice regime, because this is simply inexcusable to let one of those drop. Can't have it. I'm trying to emphasize something that I think is more powerful than just simply digging this ball. I mean, we want to dig it because it's easy, and when we do, we can almost certainly run it back at them. That's the reason. That's a reason enough. But there's a third reason that we want to focus on making sure this never drops. Never, ever. We want to keep our defensive players calm and relaxed. And when we ask our defenders to think of this first, to be focused on the dink first, that allows them to relax more and not so much worry about the driven balls. And when those driven balls are tattooed all over the court, not let them get too upset about it, not let them worry about it. Just recognize, hey, those are very difficult to dig, and we're not going to get many of them, but we are going to get these. We are going to get these. So the second priority is deflections. And I have never seen a drill run on the volleyball court that that helps build this skill to get a deflection. Deflected balls make up a tremendous amount of the defensive opportunities. And further, when we pick up deflections, we can often run them back at the opponent. We can at least get a swing. We can put a lot of these back in system. So I am so surprised when I see some of the videos of what coaches are doing and completely ignoring the incredible importance of digging the deflected balls. So coaches, please start thinking about running drills where these skills are reinforced. And the third one is shots. And this is surprisingly important on the women's side, because what the women do very often is they're hitting half and three-quarter speed shots into the corners around the block. And what happens is the defenders tend to suck forward. The play develops. They're doing that crow hop forward, and then the ladies hit shots over their head into the corners and for points. And these are easy. Like we should be picking these up a lot more than we currently are, even at the national team level. My goodness, there just makes no sense that we're not doing a better job on all of this stuff. And then so finally is the driven balls. And we're only putting this on the board because we want to make sure our defensive players recognize they're not going to dig many of these. And not to get too concerned about driven balls. I mean, even a driven ball right at you, especially on the men's side, my goodness, they're very, very difficult to dig that ball. So we're putting it on the board because we can dig some of those, keep them in play, but even when you don't dig them, we're just not going to make a living trying to dig these defensive plays on the driven balls. All right. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up how to play the game of volleyball from a tactical perspective. I want to review some of the highlights. One is ignore the middle attack. Number two, line diggers only are going to try for slop. Only playing for slop. Remember that? Number three, opposite blocker has the dig. So that's a radical change. We don't typically see the opposite blocker getting involved. And basically, the opposite blocker almost never makes a defensive play. But we feel that moving that guy forward can really help. And really, I'm leaving the best for last. But all of this together, all we're really saying is get the easy ones first. If there's one takeaway from this instructional, it's we want you to focus on getting the easy ones first, ignoring the hard-driven balls, pick up the slop, and happy volleyball. Thank you very kindly for your time. This is Next Generation Volleyball out. Please tune in to our next instructional, which will be a tactical approach to the outdoor game. Thank you kindly.